Three hungry girls broke the silence of a luxury restaurant with a simple request. What happened next made headlines around the world. The Louisiana sun beat down on the centuries-old stones of the French Quarter as Richard Montgomery adjusted the platinum watch on his wrist. Sitting on the veranda of Imperial Flavor, his most prestigious restaurant in New Orleans, he observed with satisfaction the movement of foreign tourists photographing the colonial architecture. At 39, he had achieved what many considered impossible, transforming American cuisine into an object of international desire. "More wine, Mr. Montgomery?" asked August, the sommelier he had brought from California specifically for this location. "Of course. The special label I reserved for today. We're celebrating, after all." The employee nodded reverently and stepped away. Richard adjusted his Italian silk tie and checked the notifications on his latest model smartphone. The news had just broken. On an international economic portal, Montgomery Gastronomy closes deal for first branch in Dubai. It was his 15th location, but the first outside the United States. "Your lobster, sir. Grilled with black truffle butter as requested," announced Chef Ryan, personally placing the plate in front of him. The aroma was intoxicating. The dish, a minimalist work of art, the lobster perfectly positioned over a clear amber sauce, flanked by microgreens cultivated in the restaurant's private greenhouse. A meal that cost more than the monthly salary of most Americans. Richard smiled discreetly. Born into a middle-class family in Atlanta, he had started washing dishes in a university cafeteria. His rise was meteoric after he developed a special talent, identifying what rich people wanted before they even knew it themselves. It wasn't just food, it was exclusivity. It was being able to sit where others couldn't, eat what others couldn't afford, belong to a closed circle of the privileged. His restaurants didn't just sell gastronomy, they sold status. Reservations were fought over months in advance. National and international celebrities posed at his tables and shared on social media. An empire built on the premise that some people deserved more than others. "To success," he murmured to himself, raising the cut crystal glass. The award-winning California. Wine? A $4,000 bottle slid smoothly down his throat. Through his Italian designer glasses, he observed the movement around him. Customers in impeccable attire discussing investments on the New York Stock Exchange, about seasons in Aspen, about yachts anchored in the Hamptons. His world, his conquest. At the next table, a family was celebrating a birthday. The patriarch, a real estate businessman whom Richard knew from social events, made a point of commenting loudly on the vintage of the wine they were drinking. The women displayed jewelry that sparkled under strategically positioned lighting. Well-behaved children in clothes that looked like they came from European catalogues. Richard was about to make a toast from a distance to his acquaintance when he noticed unusual movement near the railing that separated the restaurant's terrace from the historic sidewalk. Three girls appeared as if materialized from nowhere. Barefoot, with worn clothes and disheveled hair, they stared fixedly into the establishment. The oldest, who appeared no more than 12, held the hands of the two smaller ones. She had large, dark eyes, too deep for someone so young. For a moment, those eyes met Richard's and something strange happened in his chest, an uncomfortable sensation that he quickly suppressed. The girl approached the decorative railing that delimited the restaurant's space. Richard noticed when the security guard began to move toward them, but before he could intervene, the girl spoke. Her voice, although low, seemed to echo in the environment, as if all other conversations had been momentarily silenced. "We want food, mister." Three simple words, direct, devastating in their honesty. Time seemed to freeze. Nearby customers interrupted their conversations. The waiter approaching with more wine hesitated, the bottle suspended in the air. The girls remained motionless, their eyes fixed on the abundant plates, the full glasses, the abundance they had never known. Richard felt all eyes turn to him. The sensation was uncomfortable, as if he were being publicly judged. He slowly placed his utensil on the table, wiped his lips with the linen napkin and maintained a neutral expression. Years of difficult negotiations had taught him to mask emotions. "I apologize for the inconvenience," he said in a controlled voice, addressing nearby customers before making a discreet gesture to the manager who was watching the scene, tense. "Charles." The manager approached quickly. "Sir, please call security. Ask them to move those girls away before it becomes disruptive," Richard instructed in a low but firm tone. The manager nodded and said something into the communication device attached to his lapel. In seconds, two burly men in dark suits approached the railing. "Move along," said one of them, making gestures for the girls to step back. "This space is private." The oldest of the girls remained for a moment, her eyes still fixed on Richard's. There was no anger there, just a silent question that the businessman chose to ignore. Finally, she held her sister's hands and walked away, disappearing among the tourists transiting through the historic square. "Once again, I apologize," Richard said to nearby customers, raising his glass in a conciliatory toast. "New Orleans is a city of contrasts. Unfortunately, we can't always keep these worlds separate as we should." The customers nodded, understanding. Conversations resumed. The ambient music began to fill the space again. In minutes, the incident seemed forgotten. Richard resumed his meal, determined not to let anything ruin his day of celebration. What he didn't notice was the English tourist sitting discreetly in a corner who had captured the entire scene with his smartphone. The man, a social justice, content influencer with millions of followers, was already editing the video, adding captions in English. "Millionaire humiliates hungry children in New Orleans, USA. Is this the true face of success?" Richard finished his meal with tranquility, savoring each bite of the lobster and each sip of the award-winning wine. He ordered the house's exclusive dessert, a modernist reinterpretation of the traditional bread pudding decorated with edible gold leaf. While waiting, he made a video call to his team in New York, where he celebrated the numbers of the new deal with Dubai. "I want everything perfect for the inauguration in March," he instructed. "Hire that French designer who did the Paris project. Let's show how sophisticated America can be when it wants to." The sun was beginning to set when Richard finally asked for the check. He left a generous tip, as he always did, part of his carefully cultivated image of magnanimity. He descended the few steps that led to the historic street and waited for his driver to bring the imported car. While waiting, his eyes scanned the square. For a moment, he thought he saw the three girls, again watching him from a distance, but when he blinked they had disappeared, as if they had never existed. An uncomfortable sensation persisted, but Richard ignored it, entering the car that had just arrived. "To the hotel, Joshua," he instructed the driver. "I have a video conference with the Dubai investors in an hour." The car glided over the cobblestone streets, moving away from the historic center. Richard looked through the polarized window, observing the city that provided him with so much profit, but that he never really knew. Little did he know that at that exact moment, his name was beginning to circulate on social media. In 24 hours, that video of less than a minute would change his life forever. His cell phone rang. It was Mark Davis, his partner and financial director. "Richard, we need to talk urgently about the holding company," said the voice on the other end, with a tone that the businessman had never heard before. "Any problem with the Dubai contracts?" "No, it's something more serious, much more serious." The call was abruptly ended. Richard frowned, trying to return the call. The number was busy. A strange sensation began to form in his stomach, something he hadn't felt since the days when he struggled to survive in the early days of his career. The car continued toward the luxury hotel on the waterfront, while the sun disappeared on the horizon of New Orleans. The approaching night would bring much more than darkness for the king of American gastronomy. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us which city you're watching from. We'll continue. The night at the luxurious Windsor Court Hotel on Canal Street turned into Richard Montgomery's worst nightmare. Sitting on the edge of the king-size bed with a view of the Mississippi River, he observed, incredulous, the notifications exploding on his cell phone. The video of the incident with the girls at the restaurant had reached more than 2 million views in just 6 hours. The hashtag #ButchAStarvingMillionaire was already one of the most commented topics on social media. "This is absurd." "They edited the video to make it look like something it wasn't," shouted Richard to Cameron Vance, his press officer, on the other end of the video call. "Richard, I'm trying to control the damage, but it's complicated. The tourist who recorded has almost 5 million followers. Journalists are already trying to find out who the children are." Richard ran his hands over his face, feeling the fatigue accumulate. This was just an inconvenience, he thought. His public relations team would handle it, as they always did when some minor controversy arose, perhaps a clarification note, some donation to a charity. The standard protocol to calm the masses. But there was something more urgent. Mark Davis, his partner and financial director, still hadn't returned his calls since that brief and disturbing conversation in the car. Richard tried once more in vain. The phone continued to go to voicemail. The laptop on the work desk emitted an alert sound. A new email message. Subject: Urgent. Communication from the board of directors. Richard felt a chill run down his spine as he opened the message. It was an internal communication, written by Teresa Oliver, senior board member of the company. Dear shareholders and board members, it is with deep regret that I inform you of the discovery of serious financial irregularities in our holding company. Preliminary investigations point to systematic embezzlement carried out over the last 18 months, with unauthorized transfers to offshore accounts. The estimated values so far exceed $87 million. The financial director, Mr. Mark Davis, did not attend the emergency meeting called for tonight and is unreachable. The authorities have been notified. As a precaution, all corporate accounts have been temporarily blocked, and negotiations with Dubai are suspended until further notice. Extraordinary meeting scheduled for tomorrow, 9 a.m. Richard read and reread the text, trying to process the information. His empire, built over 15 years of relentless work, was being looted from within. By Mark, his college friend, best man at his failed wedding, the person he trusted most in business. The phone rang. It was Rachel Simmons, legal director of the company. "Richard, where are you?" she asked without preamble. "At the hotel in New Orleans." "What's happening, Rachel?" "The FBI has search and seizure warrants for all offices. They just left here in New York taking computers, servers, documents." Her voice trembled. "It seems Mark is on the run. He emptied the company's main accounts before disappearing." Richard felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He jumped up and approached the window, observing the city lights and the dark river in the distance. His mind worked frantically, trying to find a way out. And the reserve funds, the international accounts, the money from the Dubai negotiation? Everything, Richard. He took everything he could access. What remained was frozen by the courts. Our stocks plummeted 62% in today's trading. A heavy silence settled between them. Richard could hear Rachel's accelerated breathing on the other end of the line. "There's one more thing," she continued, with evident hesitation in her voice. "The investigation is not just about the embezzlement. It seems Mark handed over incriminating documents about the company's tax operations in recent years, operations that you approved." The penny finally dropped. It wasn't just a financial coup. It was a complete betrayal, orchestrated by someone who knew all his secrets, all his fiscal maneuvers on the borderline of legality. Mark wasn't simply stealing money, he was protecting himself and putting all the blame on Richard. "We need an immediate strategy," he said, trying to maintain composure. "Contact our lawyers in Washington, activate that judge who owes us favors. I'll return to New York on the first flight tomorrow." "Richard, you're not understanding," interrupted Rachel with a grave voice. "There's a preventive arrest warrant against you. The advice from the lawyers is that you turn yourself in voluntarily to show cooperation." The words hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. He leaned against the wall suddenly without strength in his legs. "This can't be happening," he murmured, more to himself than to Rachel. The doorbell of the suite rang, startling him. Through the peephole, he saw two men in suits in the corridor. He didn't need much imagination to guess who they were. "Rachel, I need to hang up." "They're here." Richard hung up the phone before she could respond. He took a deep breath, adjusted his posture, and opened the door, maintaining the dignity he always valued. "Mr. Richard Montgomery?" asked the older of the police officers. "We have a warrant to take you to the station. Please come with us." The next 72 hours were a confused blur in Richard's mind. Endless depositions, repetitive questions, nights poorly slept in a temporary holding cell. His lawyer, Paul Mitchell, managed to free him by paying an exorbitant bail and surrendering his passport, but the news only got worse. "Your assets are frozen," explained Paul in his improvised office in New Orleans. "The mansion in the garden district has been sealed by the Justice Department. The restaurants are under judicial intervention. The bank accounts frozen." "And my personal account abroad?" asked Richard, clinging to the last hope. Paul shook his head. "Negatively. Mark emptied that too. He knew all your passwords, remember?" Richard closed his eyes, trying to contain his desperation. In just 3 days he had lost everything: money, properties, reputation, social media, which before exalted him as an example of entrepreneurship, now mercilessly massacred him. The video with the girls in the French Quarter gained new versions, each more distorted. Journalists camped at the door of the hotel where he tried to hide, asking questions about his corrupt empire and his insensitivity to the poor. "What do I do now, Paul?" The lawyer sighed heavily, adjusting his glasses on his tired face. "Do you have any friend who can shelter you for a while? Someone discreet, away from the spotlight?" Richard reflected for a few moments. Friends. He had hundreds of contacts in his agenda, important people with whom he dined regularly, celebrities, who frequented his restaurants. But real friends? People who would welcome him in a moment of deep crisis? "I'll call Frank Miller. We've been close since college. He has a guest house in the Florida Keys," he finally said, trying to sound confident. But Frank didn't answer his calls. Neither did the other 20 friends that Richard tried to contact in the following hours. The messages were seen and ignored. Some blocked his number. The social pariah he had become became more evident with each failed attempt. On the 5th day after the scandal broke, the hotel where he was staying asked him to leave. His credit card had been declined, and the management no longer wanted the presence of a problematic client scaring tourists. With only the money he had in his wallet, just over $1,000, an amount he previously spent on a single bottle of wine, Richard moved to a simple inn in the Bywater neighborhood. The money ran out in a week. The inn evicted him unceremoniously when he couldn't pay the daily rate. His lawyer stopped answering calls when he realized he wouldn't be paid. Journalists lost interest when new scandals emerged. Richard Montgomery, formerly a symbol of American gastronomic elite, became just another desperate man on the streets of New Orleans. In the first days of total abandonment, he still tried to keep up appearances. He wore the last clean suit he owned and spent his days in shopping malls, pretending to be a busy businessman while enjoying the air conditioning and free Wi-Fi. At night, he slept on park benches, always changing locations to avoid being recognized or bothered. The suit soon became wrinkled and dirty. The beard, once meticulously trimmed, grew untidy. The Italian shoes developed holes in the soles. Hunger, a sensation that Richard had not experienced since his humble childhood, returned with overwhelming force. On a particularly hot afternoon, 3 weeks after the beginning of his fall, Richard sat on the steps of St. Louis Cathedral, exhausted and hungry. He had walked miles from downtown, trying to find some municipal shelter that would accept him. Without documents, without proof of residence, without anything that proved who he was, doors closed one after another. He observed tourists climbing, the sacred steps fulfilling promises. He saw happy families taking photos, street vendors offering souvenirs and bottled water, a world that followed its course, indifferent to his personal tragedy. That's when he noticed 3 familiar figures across the street walking among pedestrians. 3 girls with worn clothes and bare feet, the same ones from the restaurant, from the video, from the beginning of his disgrace. For an insane moment, Richard thought about confronting them, about shouting that they had ruined his life. But the truth hit him hard. It wasn't the girls who caused his fall. It was his own choices, his greed, his arrogance. He lowered his head, hoping not to be recognized, but it was too late. The oldest of the 3 had already seen him and was now walking in his direction, with her sisters in tow. Richard shrank back, preparing for the confrontation that would surely come, for the final humiliation that would complete his ruin. Instead, the girl stopped in front of him, took a piece of dry bread from a plastic bag, and, without saying a word, extended it in his direction. The gesture, simple and unexpected, broke something inside Richard. He looked at the bread, then at the girl's face, a thin face marked by deprivation, but with eyes that showed no resentment or judgment. Just a silent understanding of what it meant to be hungry. The tears which Richard had contained throughout the collapse of his life finally came. Thick, abundant, uncontrollable. He couldn't accept the bread. He couldn't speak. He just cried. For the first time in many years, exposing his fragility without reservation, before those from whom he least expected to find compassion. "Why are you crying, mister?" asked the smallest of the three girls as Richard tried to contain the tears that stained his disheveled face. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The barrier between the man he had been and what he had become completely collapsed in that moment. Sitting on the steps of St. Louis Cathedral, surrounded by tourists who passed indifferent to his drama, Richard Montgomery felt completely exposed, as if all his sins were being judged by those three pairs of childish eyes. The oldest of the girls, the one who had offered the bread, sat beside him without ceremony. She didn't seem intimidated by his tears, nor repelled by his deplorable state. The two smaller ones imitated their sister, settling on a step below. "Do you not have a home either?" asked the middle one, observing him with genuine curiosity. Richard swallowed hard, finally finding the strength to speak. "No, I don't anymore." "We don't either," said the oldest with a naturalness that cut his heart. "I'm Samantha. These are my sisters, Lily and Emma." "Richard," he responded automatically, without thinking about hiding his identity. "You're that man from the restaurant, right?" asked Lily, the middle one, with eyes too perceptive for someone so young. "We saw you there. You were eating lobster." The observation hit him like a slap. Yes, he was that man, although he seemed to have lived 1,000 lives since then. The contrast between Richard in an Italian suit savoring lobster with truffles and the current Richard, hungry and sitting on cathedral steps, was too grotesque to contemplate. "Yes, that was me," he admitted, feeling a deep shame. I'm sorry for what happened." Samantha shrugged, as if that were an unimportant detail. "Are you hungry?" she asked, extending the piece of bread again. This time, Richard accepted. His hands trembled as he held the simple food, which now seemed more valuable than any gourmet meal he had ever tasted. He bit a small piece, chewing slowly. The bread was hard, slightly moldy at the edges, but the taste of survival was undeniably powerful. "Thank you," he said, with sincerity he had never felt when thanking for something. "You're welcome," replied Samantha. "We share when we have. That's how it works on the street." Richard observed the three sisters with renewed attention. Samantha, the oldest, must have been about 12, but her eyes carried the weight of a lifetime of responsibilities. Lily, the middle one, appeared to be about 10, with a lively and alert look. Emma, the youngest, didn't seem to be more than 7, with large brown eyes that observed the world with surprising innocence, considering her circumstances. "Are you alone? Don't you have family?" asked Richard, suddenly interested in their story. A heavy silence settled. The girls exchanged glances as if silently deciding how much they could reveal. "Our mom got sick," said Samantha finally. 2 years ago, we lived in a shack in Tremé, but after she was gone, the landowner told us to leave." "And your father?" "Never knew him," replied Lily. "Mum said there were 3 different fathers, one for each of us. None of them were any good, according to her." Richard absorbed the information, feeling a tightness in his chest. 3 orphaned girls abandoned to their own luck on the streets of a large and often cruel city. And yet they were capable of offering help to a stranger, the same stranger, who had rejected them weeks before. "Where do you sleep?" he asked, concerned about the approaching nightfall. "We have a place," said Samantha, suddenly cautious. "It's safe, more or less. Can I go with you?" The question escaped before he could contain it. loaded with barely disguised desperation. The three looked at each other again, having another of those silent conversations that only siblings can have. Finally, Emma, the smallest, spoke for the first time with a thin and melodic voice. "He's sad, Sam, just like we were when Mom went away." Samantha studied Richard for a few moments, her penetrating eyes seeming to see beyond the dirt and dishevelment, straight into his broken soul. Finally, she nodded. "You can come, but you have to follow the rules." "Rules?" "Don't make noise. Don't bring anyone, don't fight, don't steal from us," she enumerated with her fingers, "and share whatever you get." Richard nodded, accepting that informal contract with more seriousness than any $1 million agreement he had ever signed. He stood up, still holding the rest of the bread as if it were a treasure, and followed the three girls who were already descending the steps with the ease of those who know every stone of the path. They walked through narrow alleys, moving away from tourist areas and entering a New Orleans that Richard had never known, despite his various restaurants in the city. They passed through alleys where children played with improvised balls, through corners where elderly people played dominoes on wobbly tables, through small businesses where the smell of spices filled the air. This was the real New Orleans, Richard realized, not the one from postcards, from expensive restaurants and luxury hotels, but the living, pulsating city, resilient in its simplicity and cultural richness. After almost 40 minutes of walking, they arrived at an abandoned area near the old port. A partially collapsed warehouse stood among decaying buildings. Samantha guided the group to the back of the construction, where a narrow opening in the wall gave access to the interior. "You have to bend down," she instructed, demonstrating how to enter. Richard followed the girls into the warehouse. The interior was surprisingly less desolate than the exterior suggested. A corner had been organized with cardboard that formed an improvised mattress, covered by some pieces of fabric that served as blankets. A wooden box functioned as a table, on which were arranged some personal objects, a broken hairbrush, a small mirror, some very worn dolls. "Home, sweet home," announced Lily, with an ironic smile that seemed misplaced on her childish face. "This is where you live?" asked Richard, trying not to sound horrified. "It's better than many places," replied Samantha with dignity. "It doesn't rain inside, there are few rats, and the bad guys don't know about it." "Bad guys?" "There are men who like to hurt children," she explained with a terrifying simplicity. "We know how to hide from them." Richard's heart tightened again. These children had learned to navigate a world of dangers that adults like him could barely imagine, and they did it with astonishing courage and dignity. Samantha indicated a corner where Richard could settle. It was nothing more than a space on the concrete floor, but for someone who had slept on park benches in recent nights, it seemed almost comfortable. The girls initiated what appeared to be their nightly routine. Lily took from a plastic bag some pieces of fruit, probably leftovers collected at the free market. Emma organized the sheets for the night. Samantha checked the entrances of the warehouse, making sure they were secure. "How long have you lived here?" asked Richard, observing the efficiency with which they moved. "About 6 months," answered Samantha. "Before we stayed under the Crescent City Connection Bridge, but there were too many bad people there." "And how do you get food?" "In different ways," said Lily, sharing a piece of mango among the three. "Sometimes we ask at restaurants at the end of the day when they're throwing food away. There's a lady at the market who saves the bruised fruit for us, and there are days when we just ask, on the streets." Richard received his piece of mango with gratitude. The fruit was too soft, almost overripe, but the sweet flavor exploded in his mouth like a revelation. When was the last time he had really savored something, appreciating each note of flavor as he did now? Night fell completely, and the darkness in the warehouse was broken only by the weak light that entered through holes in the roof. The girls settled together in their nest of cardboard and fabrics, forming a small pile of bodies to combat the cold that was beginning to infiltrate. "Good night, Richard," said Emma, her childish voice echoing in the empty space. "Good night," he replied, curling up in his corner, using the dirty jacket as an inadequate blanket. For hours, Richard remained awake, listening to the breathing of the three, girls who slept deeply, confident in his presence, despite barely knowing him. Their trust moved and terrified him at the same time. What had he done to deserve this? And more importantly, how could he repay it? In the darkness of that abandoned warehouse, surrounded by 3 children who had nothing but shared everything, Richard felt something awaken inside him. It wasn't just shame for his past behavior, nor just gratitude for the unexpected welcome. It was something deeper, more transformative, a new consciousness which was beginning to see the world with different eyes. For the first time in years, Richard Montgomery fell asleep without thinking about money, status, or power. His last thought before falling asleep was a silent promise made to himself and those 3 girls. If he ever found a way back, it wouldn't be to the life he had before. The following days established a strange but functionally harmonious routine. Samantha, accustomed to leading her sisters in the daily battle for survival, naturally included Richard in her plans. In the morning, they separated into pairs. Samantha went with Emma to the farmer's market, where they helped merchants organize stalls in exchange for fruits and vegetables. Richard accompanied Lily to the waterfront, where they collected cans and plastic bottles to sell to a known recycler. "You can't go ask for food at restaurants with us," explained Samantha with brutal pragmatism. "People give more when it's just children. A big man scares them." Richard accepted the impeccable logic, swallowing the pride that once would have prevented him from accepting such an arrangement. At the end of the afternoon, they gathered at the warehouse to share what they had managed to get. Richard was surprised by Lily's ability to negotiate with the recycling collector, getting a few extra dollars for the collected material. "Where did you learn to negotiate like that?" he asked, genuinely impressed. "By watching," she answered. "Simply. We learn fast on the street. Those who don't—" She didn't complete the sentence, but it wasn't necessary. Richard now understood what that omission meant. At night, before sleeping, another routine was established. Richard told stories. He discovered that the girls had never regularly attended school, and their knowledge was fragmented, collected, from overheard conversations and lived experiences. So he began to narrate classic stories, explain basic math concepts, describe distant countries he had visited on his business trips. The girls absorbed everything with a thirst for knowledge that moved him. Emma, especially, showed a sharp intelligence, asking questions that often caught him off guard. "If the world is round, why don't we fall off?" she asked one night, after Richard had explained about the shape of the planet. "Because of gravity," he answered, trying to simplify the concept. "It's like a giant magnet inside the Earth that pulls everything toward the center." "So we're stuck to the ground?" she insisted. "More or less like that," smiled Richard. "It's an invisible force, but very strong." "Like our mom's love," concluded Emma, with a wisdom that made everyone silent for a moment. "We can't see it anymore, but we still feel it." That night, after the girls fell asleep, Richard cried again. These weren't tears of self-pity as before, but of a more complex emotion. These children, whom society treated as invisible, possessed an inner richness that many of his former millionaire friends would never know. And they were, day after day, without realizing it, teaching him to see the world with new eyes. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us which city you're watching from. We'll continue. 2 weeks had passed since Richard found refuge with the 3 sisters. His beard, now completely grown, covered the face that once graced business magazines. The clothes, which he used to change daily, were now reduced to pieces donated by a social assistance center that Samantha knew. The platinum watch and Italian shoes had been traded for food in a moment of extreme hunger. Outwardly, nothing remained of the powerful businessman who had commanded a gastronomic empire, but inside, something new was growing. "Richard, wake up!" Lily's voice pulled him from his light sleep. "Today is pasta's soup day." He opened, his eyes disoriented for a few seconds, before recognizing the zinc roof of the abandoned warehouse. The pasta's soup was what the girls called the weekly food distribution carried out by a parish downtown. It was one of the few moments when they managed a complete and hot meal. "I'm coming," he replied, getting up from the hard floor that, surprisingly, his body was beginning to accept as normal. He watched Samantha help Emma comb her hair with a broken brush. Even living on the streets, the oldest of the sisters insisted on maintaining certain rituals of dignity. "We may be poor, but we don't need to be sloppy," she frequently said, probably echoing the words of her deceased mother. "I brought water," announced Lily, entering with a full PET bottle. "Got it from the park fountain. It's clean today." Richard used a little to wash his face and hands. Water, which once flowed abundantly from his gold-plated faucets, was now a precious resource carefully rationed. They left the warehouse together, mixing with the morning movement of the city. New Orleans woke up in layers. First the workers, who depended on public transportation, then the merchants, followed by office workers, and much later the tourists. Richard, who once belonged to the layer that woke up only when he wished, was now part of the first group, those for whom every minute of sunlight meant a chance of survival. On the way to the parish, Samantha suggested a detour. "Let's pass by the French market. Sometimes the vendors give leftovers of yesterday's food." The group followed the hill that led to the famous crafts market. Richard had frequented the place before, but always as a tourist, buying expensive souvenirs for foreign business partners. He had never noticed the complex social network that existed behind the scenes. The vendors who saved food for specific street children, the security guards who turned a blind eye to small food thefts, the cleaners who alerted about police in operation. "Miss Zoe," called Samantha, waving to a middle-aged black woman who was organizing her food stall. "My girls," replied the woman. With a genuine smile, her eyes passed quickly over Richard, evaluating him without visible judgment. "And who's this with you?" "He's our friend," explained Lily. "He doesn't have a home either." The simplicity of the introduction made Richard feel a wave of emotion. Friend. After losing millions, discovering that his social circle was made of opportunists and spending weeks on the streets, that simple word coming from a child sounded like the most honorable title he had ever received. Miss Zoe handed over a bag with 3 po' boys from the previous day. They weren't as crispy as they should be, but the aroma was still wonderful. "Today there's enough for everyone," she said, adding a 4th sandwich after seeing Richard. "Take care of these girls, mister. They're special." "I know," he replied, with a sincerity that surprised even himself. "They're taking more care of me, actually." The woman smiled, recognizing something in his eyes that went beyond appearances. "Sometimes we need to lose everything to find what matters, don't we?" Richard nodded, unable to respond in the face of that woman's simple and direct wisdom. How could Miss Zoe know? Was he so transparent, so transformed that even strangers could read his story on his face? They continued on their way to the parish, where a line was already forming. Men, women, and children in street situations, elderly people with worn but clean clothes, single mothers with babies in their arms, a sample of the New Orleans that tourists rarely saw, that restaurants like his made a point of keeping away. "Stay." "Here," instructed Samantha, indicating a place in line. "I'll see if I can find Mrs. Celeste. She always saves bread for us." While they waited, Richard observed the people around him. Complete life stories stamped on faces marked by the sun and the hardness of existence. There was dignity there, he now realized, a dignity he had never noticed before, when his gaze was blurred by privilege. An elderly man in the line ahead caught his attention. With a bent back, he held an empty container with trembling hands. He must have been more than 80 years old, Richard calculated, and he was alone. What circumstances would have led that elderly man to the situation of needing community soup? Where would his family be? What stories could those deep wrinkles tell? "His name is Mr. Anderson," commented Emma, noticing Richard's gaze. "He was a math teacher. He knows all the calculations by heart." "You know him?" asked Richard, surprised. "Everyone. Knows everyone on the street," explained Lily. "It's like a big, messy family." A family. The word resonated in Richard's mind. For years, his obsession with professional success had sabotaged any chance of building lasting family ties. His marriage had failed after only 3 years without children. His parents had passed away while he was busy expanding his business. True friendships were sacrificed on the altar of success. And now, ironically, he found a sense of family among strangers, united by misery. The line advanced slowly. When they finally received their portions of hot soup and thick slices of bread, Richard felt a gratitude he had never experienced at dinners costing hundreds of dollars. They sat in a corner of the church courtyard, savoring each spoonful as if it were a treasure. "Look over there," Samantha pointed discreetly. Across the courtyard, a young woman with 2 small children had just arrived. By the state of their clothes and the evident exhaustion on her face, Richard deduced they lived in precarious conditions. The children, a boy and a girl who couldn't be more than 5 years old, visibly trembled despite the heat that morning. They arrived in the city yesterday," explained Samantha. "They came from the countryside. Her husband got sick and couldn't work on the farm anymore. They came to try their luck in New Orleans." "How do you know all this?" asked Richard, impressed. "We talked to them yesterday at the bus stop. They slept there." Richard observed the family with renewed attention. The mother tried to calm the children, promising they would eat soon. The boy coughed continuously, a dry and worrying sound. The temperature had dropped considerably the night before, one of those unexpected cold fronts that sometimes hit New Orleans. Without any warning, Samantha got up, walked to where the group was, and in a gesture that left Richard stunned, took off her own shirt, one of only 2 she owned, and offered it to the mother, pointing to the boy who was coughing. The woman hesitated, visibly moved, but Samantha insisted with a smile. After a brief dialogue that Richard couldn't hear, the mother accepted the piece of clothing and immediately put it on her son, who stopped trembling. When Samantha returned, Richard couldn't contain the question, "Why did you do that? It was one of your only shirts." The answer came simple, direct, without any pretension of heroism, because they needed it more. 4 words. Simple, crystalline in their childish logic, and yet so profoundly revolutionary that Richard felt as if something inside him broke and reconstructed itself simultaneously. Because they needed it more. It wasn't ostentatious charity, like the ones he himself had practiced, donating large sums to institutions that would put his name on golden plaques. It wasn't calculated philanthropy for tax deductions or corporate image improvement. It was simply the most basic human response to the suffering of others, sharing what you have with those who need more. In that moment, Richard understood something fundamental that had escaped him throughout his adult life. True wealth was not in accumulating but in sharing, not in erecting walls to separate worlds, but in building bridges to connect them. The tears came, silent but impossible to contain. Lily, misinterpreting his emotion, held his hand firmly. "Don't be sad, Richard. Sam has another shirt." He smiled through the tears. "I'm not sad, Lily. I'm waking up, finally waking up." That afternoon, as they walked back to the warehouse, Richard observed the city with completely new eyes. He now saw what was once invisible to him: the young man selling candy at the traffic light to pay for college, the lady collecting cans, while reciting poetry to herself, the group of young people organizing a community library in an improvised space. New Orleans revealed itself as multifaceted, vibrant in its daily struggle, rich in its human diversity. The city he thought he knew by owning restaurants in its tourist spots now showed itself as an infinitely more complex and fascinating universe. At night, lying in his corner of the warehouse, Richard couldn't sleep. An idea was beginning to take shape in his mind, something so absurd that he didn't dare share it yet. What if he could create a space where no one needed to ask for food? A place where those who have little could eat with dignity, and those who have much could learn what really matters. It was madness, of course. He had no money, no contacts, no credibility, but he had something he never possessed before, a vision that went beyond profit, a visceral understanding of what it meant to be hungry, and the inspiration of 3 children who, with nothing, had taught him everything. "Samantha," he called softly, unable to contain the impulse to share. "Are you awake?" "Yes," she replied, her voice small in the darkness. "What is it?" "If you could change one thing in the world, what would it be?" The girl was silent for a few moments, thoughtful. "I'd want no one to have to ask for food," she finally answered. "I'd want everyone to be able to sit at a nice table and eat good things, without having to be ashamed or afraid." Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. It was exactly what he was thinking, as if the girl had read his thoughts. "Why?" asked Samantha, curious about the sudden question. "Because I think maybe we can make that happen." "How?" Her voice contained a mixture of disbelief and hope. "I don't know exactly yet," admitted Richard, "but I promise I'll figure it out." In the dark, he couldn't see Samantha's smile, but he could feel it, like a small light lighting up in the darkness of the warehouse. A silent promise had been made that night, a seed planted in the unlikely terrain of shared misery. The next morning, Richard woke up with a determination he hadn't felt since the early days of his career. He was going to try the impossible, and somehow he knew those three girls would be by his side every step of the way. "We're going to take a different kind of walk today," he announced during the improvised breakfast, which consisted of leftover bread from the previous day's distribution. "I want to show you a special place." The girls followed him, curious, as he guided them through alleys and shortcuts until they reached a quiet residential neighborhood away from downtown. "Where are we?" asked Lily, looking around with curiosity. "Bayou St. John," replied Richard, "one of the oldest neighborhoods in New Orleans." They stopped in front of a small grocery store with a faded facade and a simple sign, "Earth's Flavors, Grocery and Produce." Through the window, they could see an elderly lady organizing fruits in wicker baskets. "Who is she?" asked Emma, pointing to the woman. Richard took a deep breath, gathering courage. "I don't know yet, but I hope she's the first person to believe in a crazy dream I had." Josephine Santos, owner of the Earth's Flavors grocery store, was a 72-year-old lady with hands calloused by work and eyes that had witnessed more stories than any book could contain. Born in rural Louisiana, she had come to New Orleans as a young woman, carrying only a suitcase of clothes and the determination to survive. She started selling fruits in a basket on the streets, until she managed 3 decades later to open her own grocery store in the Bayou St. John neighborhood. When Richard entered, her establishment accompanied by 3 street girls, Mrs. Josephine showed no surprise. In 50 years of business, she had learned not to judge people by their appearance. "Good morning," she greeted, adjusting the reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck. "How can I help you?" Richard hesitated. How to explain what he had come to do? How to condense the transformation he had undergone, the vision he had, the seemingly impossible dream he now nurtured? "Mrs. Josephine," he began, surprising her by knowing her name, which was discreetly embroidered on the apron she wore. "My name is Richard Montgomery. Until a few months ago, I was the owner of a chain of luxury restaurants." The woman studied him more carefully, trying to see beyond the unshaven beard and worn clothes. "Montgomery, from the Imperial Flavor restaurants?" "Yes," he confirmed, slightly surprised at being recognized. "I saw your story in the papers," she commented, without changing her expression. "Seems like life played quite a trick on you." "Life and my own choices," admitted Richard. "And what brings you to my humble grocery store?" asked Mrs. Josephine, crossing her arms over her chest. "I doubt you've come to buy bananas," Richard smiled, appreciating the lady's direct frankness. "I came to propose an idea that might sound like madness." In the next 30 minutes, Richard outlined his plan. He talked about his fall, about how the 3 girls had welcomed him when he was at rock bottom, about how he had discovered a New Orleans he had never really known. And then, with growing enthusiasm, he explained his dream: to create a space where people in vulnerable situations could eat with dignity, without having to pay, without explanations, without judgments. "A restaurant for those who can't pay," summarized Mrs. Josephine when he finished. "Exactly," confirmed Richard. "A place where food is just food, not a symbol of status or power, where the only requirement to sit at the table is to be human and to be hungry." The lady remained silent, her eyes moving from the girls to Richard, evaluating. "And what does that have to do with me?" she finally asked. I don't have money to invest in dreams, however beautiful they may be. The grocery store has a basement, doesn't it? Asked Richard, surprising her. I saw the stairs at the back when we entered. Yes, there's a basement. I use it as a storage room, but it's practically empty since I reduced the stock during the pandemic. That's all we need to start. A space. Richard leaned over the counter, his eyes shining with determination. Mrs. Josephine, I'm not asking for money. I'm asking for a chance, a corner to start something that can transform lives. The woman took a deep breath, looking again at the three girls who remained quiet, observing the conversation with hopeful eyes. You know you failed spectacularly in your field, don't you? She asked, with a frankness that would have offended the old Richard, but that he now received with humility. What makes you think you can succeed in this? Because before I built walls, replied Richard, the words flowing with a conviction that surprised even himself. Now I want to build bridges. Before my goal was profit, now it's purpose. Mrs. Josephine slowly uncrossed her arms, her eyes fixed on Richard's, as if looking for something specific there. I'm 72 years old, she said, after a long silence. I've seen a lot in this life. I've seen rich people fall and poor people rise. I've seen people with everything lose their humanity, and people with nothing donate the little they had. I've never seen, however, someone who lost everything find something greater than what they had before. Richard waited, heart racing. The girls approached him, Emma holding his hand in an instinctive gesture of support. The basement is full of junk, continued Mrs. Josephine. It will need a good cleaning, and it leaks when it rains hard. We can handle it, Richard promptly replied. I don't have money for renovations, she warned. We're not asking. The lady sighed, then smiled slightly. My husband, God rest his soul, always said that the true wealth of a man is measured by what he does when he has nothing. She made a gesture toward the back of the store. Come see the space. The stairs that led to the basement were steep and poorly lit. The space itself was larger than Richard expected, approximately 80 square meters, with a low ceiling and stone walls that indicated the ancient age of the construction. Empty boxes, broken furniture, and other junk occupied much of the place, but Richard could already visualize the potential. It's perfect, he declared, not caring about the mold stains on the walls or the uneven cement floor. You have a very optimistic view of what's perfect, commented Mrs. Josephine with irony. But the space is yours if you can transform it. Can we? Asked Lily, her eyes wide with excitement. Can we really have it? You can, confirmed the lady, with 3 conditions. First, don't interfere with the operation of the grocery store. Second, take full responsibility for what happens down here. Third, if one day this really works, I want you to feed the elderly from the St. Clara nursing home down the street for free. Deal, replied Richard without hesitation, extending his hand to seal the agreement. As they shook hands, Mrs. Josephine held his for an extra moment. There's something in your eyes that wasn't there in the newspaper photos, Montgomery, she observed. Seems like you really found something that money can't buy. I did, he agreed, looking at the 3 girls who were already exploring the basement with childish enthusiasm. And now I want to share it. The following days were of hard work and unexpected discoveries. Cleaning the basement proved to be a Herculean task, but Richard now counted on allies he never imagined having. Samantha spread the word among the community of homeless people, and soon volunteers appeared. Mr. Anderson, the retired math teacher, Matthew, a young man who lived under the Crescent City Connection Bridge, Mrs. Claudia, a lady who sold candy, downtown and had extraordinary organizational skills. Why are you helping? Richard asked Matthew while both removed junk. Because we need to believe in something, replied the young man with simplicity, and because the girls said you really care. The silent approval of Samantha, Lily, and Emma had opened doors that Richard would never be able to open alone. The trust that the children placed in him served as a seal of authenticity for those who lived on the margins of society and had learned, by necessity, to distrust the powerful. As the basement took shape, Richard faced the most complex challenge, getting equipment and supplies. Without money, without credit, without a name, How to set up a restaurant, even a simple one? The answer came from unexpected directions. Mr. Anderson had a nephew who had worked as a cook in one of Richard's restaurants before being fired during staff cuts. "My name is Ryan," the man introduced himself when Richard received him in the now partially renovated basement. "I was assistant chef at Imperial Flavor in Memphis for 3 years." Richard made an effort to remember, but couldn't recognize him. How many employees had he ignored during his career? How many faces had passed invisibly through his life? "Sorry, I don't remember you," he admitted with honesty. "I didn't expect you to remember," replied Ryan with no apparent resentment. "You rarely spoke to the kitchen staff, but I remember you well. And yet you want to help." Ryan looked around at the rudimentary space that was beginning to take the form of a community kitchen. "My uncle told me what you're trying to do here. It's unexpected, coming from you." He paused. "I've been unemployed for 3 months. I have skills that can be useful, and honestly, I need to do something that matters." Richard extended his hand, which Ryan firmly shook. "I can't promise a salary," he warned. "I'm not asking," replied the chef, "for now." With Ryan came his network of contacts, other unemployed professionals from the gastronomy area, suppliers. He knew in the markets friends in community associations. The news that the ex-magnate of gastronomy was setting up a free restaurant for people in vulnerable situations began to circulate in increasingly wider circles. Mrs. Josephine, who had initially maintained a skeptical distance from the project, gradually became more involved. She started by offering fruits and vegetables that would be left over, then introduced Richard to other merchants in the neighborhood. Gradually, small donations began to arrive. A used industrial stove from a restaurant that had closed, pots and utensils from a culinary school, tablecloths discarded by a buffet. "People want to believe in something good," commented Mrs. Josephine, observing the transformation of the basement, especially after difficult times. After a month of intensive work, the space was unrecognizable. Walls painted white, simple but stable tables, a functional kitchen equipped with the essentials. There was no luxury, no sophistication, but there was soul, something that Richard now understood to be much more valuable than any expensive decoration. When everything seemed ready for the inauguration, Richard gathered his unlikely team in the renovated basement. "We need a name," he announced, "something that represents what we want to be." "How about free restaurant?" suggested Matthew. "Direct and simple." "Or food for all," added Mr. Anderson. Samantha, who usually remained quiet during adults' discussions, stepped forward. "Everyone's table," she said with conviction, "because it's not just about food, it's about sitting together." An appreciative silence followed her words. Richard felt a lump in his throat. That 12-year-old girl had perfectly captured the essence of what they were trying to build. "Everyone's table," he repeated, savoring the words. "It's perfect." The night before the inauguration, Richard couldn't sleep. Sitting on the steps of the entrance to the grocery store, he contemplated the stars while anxiety and hope mixed in his chest. They had announced the opening of the space, through simple posters spread around shelters, social assistance centers, and places frequented by homeless people. They didn't know how many would appear or if anyone would appear. "Can't sleep either?" Mrs. Josephine's voice surprised him. "There's a lot at stake tomorrow," replied Richard. The lady sat beside him on the steps, with the ease of someone decades younger. "You know, when you showed up here with those girls, I thought you were just another rich man fallen from grace, trying to redeem himself with grand gestures," she confessed. "I thought you would give up at the first difficulty." "And what do you think now?" asked Richard, genuinely curious. Mrs. Josephine observed the stars for a moment before answering. "I think you're really building something bigger than everything you lost." The words penetrated deep into Richard, calming some of the fears that afflicted him. "I'm afraid of failing them," he admitted, thinking of the children, of Ryan, of all who had trusted in his vision. "That all of this is just a delusion born of despair." "Every dream seems like a delusion before becoming reality," philosophized the lady. "The important thing is that you're no longer alone in this delusion." She was right, Richard realized. It was no longer his project, his vision, his redemption. Everyone's table already belonged to all who had contributed to making it real, and to those who would still come to share its space. The next morning, the small team was at their posts since early. Ryan commanded the kitchen, preparing a simple but tasty jambalaya, accompanied by rice, cornbread, and oranges. The tables were arranged with simple white tablecloths and wildflowers that Emma had collected. At the entrance, a hand-painted sign by Lily announced, "Everyone's table. Enter, sit, eat. Here you are welcome." At 11 in the morning, when they opened the doors, Richard felt his heart race at seeing the empty street. What if no one came? What if all this effort was in vain? "Calm down," said Samantha beside him. "People will come, trust." And they came. First, timidly, an elderly man whom Richard recognized from the community soup line, then a woman with 2 children, then a group of young men who lived under the bridge. The news spread quickly, and in an hour the line was around the corner. Richard, Samantha, Lily, and Emma received each person at the door, inviting them to enter and sit wherever they wanted. There were no registrations, no questions, no judgments. Just a sincere invitation. Please sit at the table. Mrs. Josephine observed from the entrance of the grocery store, eyes misty with the growing movement. When the clock struck noon, the basement was packed with people eating, talking, sharing stories. Richard circulated among the tables, serving water, asking if everything was okay, truly connecting with each person. In a corner, he noticed a familiar face, the mother with the 2 children whom Samantha had helped weeks before, the one to whom the girl had given her shirt. "How are you?" he asked, approaching. "Better," replied the woman with a small smile. "I got a job as a cleaner. We're in a shelter for now." She hesitated. "The girl Samantha invited us to come here today." "I'm glad you came," said Richard sincerely. "It's a special place you've created," commented the woman, looking around. "It's not just the food, it's the dignity." The word hit Richard deeply. Dignity. It was exactly what he wanted to offer, not charity that humiliates, but welcome that dignifies. At the end of the first day, they had served more than 200 meals. The pots were empty, the team exhausted, but an electric energy of achievement filled the environment. "We did it," said Ryan, taking off his apron. "We really did it." "Yes," agreed Richard, looking around at the space that now truly deserved the name it carried. "But this is just the beginning." That night, lying in the small room at the back of the grocery store that Mrs. Josephine had given to him and the girls, Richard couldn't stop smiling. For the first time in months, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, he felt completely at peace, as if he were finally exactly where he should be, doing exactly what he should be doing. "Sam," he called softly to the girl who was reading, a used book in the dim light of a lamp. "Thank you." "For what?" she asked, confused. "For showing me the way." The girl smiled, that rare and precious smile that illuminated her whole face. "We just showed you the door," she replied with wisdom, beyond her years. "You're the one who chose to walk through it." 3 years had passed since the inauguration of Everyone's Table. What had begun as a small improvised cafeteria in the basement of a grocery store had transformed into a movement that surpassed the borders of New Orleans and inspired similar initiatives in other American cities. Richard Montgomery, now with slightly graying hair at the temples and eyes marked by expression lines, no longer resembled the arrogant businessman of before. He dressed in a simple but neat manner and carried with him an aura of quiet satisfaction that no previous financial success had provided. "The TV people are here again," announced Ryan, entering the small improvised office at the back of what was now the main headquarters of the project. "They want to interview you about the expansion to Miami." Richard smiled, closing the folder of documents he was analyzing. "Send them to talk to Samantha. She explains better than I do." Samantha, now 15, had become the most recognizable face of the project. Her story as one of the founders, added to the sharp intelligence and communication ability she had developed in recent years, made her a natural spokesperson. She studied formally now, like her sisters, at a public school nearby, thanks to a partnership that the project had established With the Department of Education. She's busy with the nutrition team, replied Ryan. They're finalizing next week's menu. Richard nodded, getting up. The chef, who had started as a volunteer, was now the operations director of the project, receiving a modest but dignified salary, as did the other 30 permanent employees, many of whom had previously been users of the service. I'll talk to them then. Where are they? At the main entrance. And there's one more thing, added Ryan with a sparkle in his eyes. The New York City Hall called. They want to establish an official partnership to implement the model there. Richard couldn't contain a wider smile. Each new city that adopted the concept represented thousands of people who could eat with dignity. The growth of everyone's table had been organic and unexpected. 2 weeks after the inauguration, an independent journalist published an article about the initiative on an online portal. The story of the ex-billionaire who had lost everything and now served free meals alongside 3 street girls had all the elements to capture the public's imagination. The video that Samantha had recorded, serving a homeless man with the same respect and attention as a starred restaurant waiter, went viral on social media. Reporters began to appear. Donations emerged, small at first, then increasingly larger. 6 months after the opening, a businessman from the organic food industry offered funding to expand the project. Richard initially hesitated, fearing to compromise the essence of what they had created. But the council he had formed, composed of Mrs. Josephine, Mr. Anderson, Ryan, and the 3 girls, voted unanimously in favor, with one condition. They would maintain total control over the operation. With the new funding, they opened a second unit in another neighborhood of New Orleans, then a third. In 2 years, they were present in 5 major cities in the South, always maintaining the same principle: quality food, served with dignity, without questions, without judgments, open to all. Richard left the office, greeting employees and volunteers. Along the way, the current space was very different from the original basement, a large, well-ventilated hall with capacity for 300 people simultaneously. The tables were simple but comfortable, decorated with fresh flowers and clean tablecloths. The industrial kitchen, visible through large glass windows, allowed visitors to observe the preparation of food, a lesson that Richard had brought from his days as a restaurateur, adapted for a new purpose. At the entrance, a television crew from a national network was waiting. Next to them, Lily, now 13, was already orienting the reporter about the rules for filming. "You can't focus on the face of anyone who doesn't authorize it," she explained with seriousness, "and we have to verify before mentioning personal stories, agreed?" The journalist nodded, visibly impressed with the teenager's maturity. Lily had developed a natural talent for public relations, managing the project's communication with a sensitivity that many adult professionals did not possess. "Richard," she called, seeing him approach, "they want to know about the numbers of the national project." The interview proceeded smoothly. Richard had learned to talk about the project without making it about himself, a skill that the old Richard Montgomery would never have understood, much less mastered. He talked about the 15 restaurants already in operation, the 25,000 meals served daily across the country, the professional training programs they had implemented, allowing users to eventually become employees. "And what about the resources?" asked the reporter. "How do you manage to keep all this running for free?" "It's not free," Richard gently corrected. "It just doesn't charge money from those who don't have it. We have corporate partners who finance part of the operations, individual donations, and a system where those who can pay what they want, subsidizing those who cannot." This was one of the secrets of the model's success. The restaurant was open to everyone, regardless of their financial condition. Executives from neighboring companies lunched side by side with homeless people. University students shared a table with elderly people from public shelters. The diversity created a unique environment where social barriers naturally dissolved. "But you don't receive a salary, correct?" insisted the journalist. "Even being the founder and director of the project?" Richard smiled, thinking about how his definition of wealth had completely changed. "I receive housing, food, and a small allowance for basic necessities, just like all the project coordinators. It's more than enough. After the interview, Richard checked his watch. It was almost time. Today was a special day, the 3rd anniversary of the inauguration of the first restaurant, and they had planned something symbolic for the celebration. We go?" asked Emma, appearing at his side. The youngest, now 10 years old, studied music in a social project and already showed exceptional talent for the piano. Sam said everything is ready. Richard followed the girl to the simple car that the project used for official displacements. Lily was already in the back seat, animatedly talking with Mrs. Josephine, who at 75 years old maintained the same energy and determination as always. "To the French Quarter, then?" asked the driver, a former user of the restaurant who now worked, formerly with a registered employment card. "Yes, Claude. To the French Quarter." The trip to the historic centre was filled with animated conversations about future plans. Emma talked about the children's choir they were forming with children from the restaurants. Lily commented on the new partnership with a university to document the social impact of the project. Mrs. Josephine, who now acted as a senior advisor, brought updates about a new organic food supplier. Richard observed through the window the New Orleans he had learned to truly know and love in recent years. He no longer saw it divided between the tourist city and the invisible city, but as a complex and fascinating whole, full of challenges and potential. The car stopped near Jackson Square. The group walked to a large, recently renovated colonial building where a crowd was already gathering. Colorful banners announced, "Inauguration, Everyone's Table, French Quarter Unit." This was the most ambitious project so far, transforming a former luxury restaurant, ironically, the same imperial flavor where everything had begun, into the largest unit of the network, with capacity for 350 people simultaneously. Samantha waited at the entrance, dressed with simplicity but elegance, her hair elaborately braided for the special occasion. Beside her, a team of young people wearing T-shirts with the project's logo, a simple table with places for everyone, organized the entrance of the guests. "It's time," she said to Richard with a contained but genuine smile. "Nervous?" "A little," he admitted. "This place has many memories." 3 years before, in that same location, he had denied food to 3 hungry girls, concerned only with the comfort of his rich clients and with his own image. The irony of the moment escaped no one, especially when Lily asked Emma to ring the bell that symbolized the official opening of each new unit. "Welcome to Everyone's Table," announced Samantha on the microphone, her clear and confident voice echoing through the historic square. "A place where no one needs to be ashamed of being hungry, where the only requirement to sit is to be human." The audience applauded enthusiastically. Present were journalists, local authorities, project partners, employees from all units in New Orleans, and, most importantly, hundreds of regular users of the restaurants. Richard stepped forward to make his brief speech when something caught his attention across the street. On the terrace of a luxury restaurant, one of many that still operated in the tourist center, a man in an expensive suit dined alone. At the edge of the railing that separated the establishment from the sidewalk, 3 barefoot children stared fixedly at the food. The scene was so similar to the one he himself had starred in 3 years before that Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. He observed, paralyzed, as the customer noticed the children and made a gesture of discomfort to the manager. "Richard," called Samantha, concerned with his sudden paleness, "is everything okay?" He didn't answer. Without thinking, twice, he handed the microphone to the young woman and crossed the street with determined steps. He approached the children at the exact moment when 2 security guards arrived to move them away. "Hi," said Richard, crouching down to be at their height. They were 2 boys and a girl, none older than 8. "Are you hungry?" The children nodded timidly, looking with distrust at the security guards who had stopped, uncertain about how to proceed now that an adult had intervened. "Come with me," invited Richard, extending his hands. "There's a place nearby where you can eat as much as you want without having to ask." The little ones hesitated, but something in Richard's look, perhaps the absolute sincerity, perhaps the complete absence of judgment, convinced them. They accepted his hands and followed him. Richard cast a last look at the man on the terrace, who observed the scene with an indignant expression. There was no anger in his heart, just a deep understanding. That man was trapped in the same invisible prison in which he himself had lived for so many years. He crossed back to the other side of the street with the children, approaching Samantha, who observed everything with an understanding smile. "3 more for our table?" she asked. "The table is for everyone," replied Richard with simplicity. The crowd naturally opened the way, allowing the children to enter the restaurant first. Inside, the space that was once a symbol of exclusivity had been transformed into its exact opposite, a welcoming environment where all social differences dissolved in the face of shared humanity. The children were guided to a specially decorated table in the center of the hall, where Lily and Emma already awaited them with welcoming smiles. Richard observed the scene with his heart overflowing with an emotion he couldn't name, something between gratitude, fulfillment, and a deep peace. Mrs. Josephine approached, positioning herself at his side. "The circle completes itself, doesn't it?" commented the wise lady. "Yes," agreed Richard, "but it also opens to new possibilities." She nodded, perfectly understanding what he meant. "You know what impresses me most about you, Montgomery?" she asked, using the surname as she did in the early days, now as a term of endearment. "It's not that you found a purpose after losing everything. It's that you continue finding new purposes every day." Richard smiled, observing the packed restaurant, people of all social classes sharing not just food, but stories, smiles, humanity. In one corner, Samantha was orienting new volunteers. In another, Lily was photographing the event for the project's social networks. Emma was beginning to play the piano, filling the environment with a delicate and hopeful melody. The 3 girls who had changed his life were no longer just the girls. They were young women in formation, each developing their own talents and interests, treading paths that would have been inaccessible to them before. They continued living together, with Richard and Mrs. Josephine in a simple house in the Bayou St. John neighborhood, forming an unlikely but deeply connected family. Looking at the 3 new children who had just received their plates, Richard saw the cycle begin again. How many more lives could they transform? How many bridges could they still build between worlds that insisted on remaining separate? The story had not yet ended. In fact, as he realized at that moment, it was just beginning to multiply, like an echo that grows instead of diminishing, like waves that spread when a stone is thrown into the water. "Come," called Samantha, gesturing for him to join the central table. "Let's all eat together. It's a day to celebrate." Richard walked to the table, sitting between the newly arrived children and his 3 girls who were no longer so little. He looked around at the smiling faces, at the human diversity gathered under the same roof, at the dignity restored in each person present. In the end, he thought, it wasn't about restaurants or food or social projects. It was about rediscovering our shared humanity, our responsibility to each other, our capacity for transformation. It was about understanding that no one is really complete, while others remain broken. The true luxury, Richard Montgomery realized, as he shared bread with strangers who quickly became family, wasn't in the 5-star restaurants or award-winning wines. It was in the sincere smiles, in the extended hands, in the bridges built between worlds previously separated. It was at the table where everyone finally could sit. Dear listeners, we hope Richard Montgomery's journey has touched your heart. This story of transformation and discovery reminds us that it's never too late to change, and that sometimes we need to lose everything to find what really matters. If this narrative resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel to discover other equally inspiring stories. Leave your like so we can reach more people with messages of hope and transformation. And tell us in the comments, which moment of this story touched you the most? What would you do if you had the chance to start over like Richard? We're eager to read your reflections and continue together